Writing the bones, reading the stars. Untold stories of the I Ching, featuring an alternate version of the I Ching. Here's the ancient Chinese writing system from at least 1000 BC. But long before the Chinese began to write, they were reading. They were reading the stars. The Chinese needed to read the stars in order to time the agricultural seasons. Here's an example of a constellation that the ancient Chinese would watch in order to observe the passage of the seasons. It's a dragon, a celestial dragon. Those are the horns on the right, and you can see its neck, its legs, and its tail at the end. Now, in the midst of winter, the constellation was below the eastern horizon of China. Of course, there's an ocean to the east, so when the stars come up in the east, it seemed that they came up out of the ocean. So here's the dragon in the depths of the ocean during the winter solstice. In spring, they had a saying, "Look for the dragon horns in the fields in March," and you can see it just starting to peek out. In April, they'd say, "Now it's jumping," and "now leaping from the depths" in mid-May. Finally, they would look for the flying dragon in the skies on the summer solstice, the peak growing season. And then in fall, you'd see a so-called necked dragon, and this is symbolic for the harvest, where you cut the head off the grain and store it for the following year. And so they would say that it was a necked dragon. It was cut off at the neck. And what's stunning is here we find the story of the necked dragon in the very first hexagram of the I Ching. So these kinds of stories are found throughout the I Ching, and they're baked in. They come from all kinds of sources. They could come from what I'm going to look at later, a wedding story of the Zhou dynasty. There's also an alternate version of the I Ching with a whole different set of traditional stories attached to it, many of them ancient legends. This is what an ancient book in China looked like, written on bamboo. The I Ching was written on a bamboo book like this. And in the next slide, you'll see the archaeological remains of a newly discovered version of the I Ching. There it is, a bamboo book, slightly decayed, excavated from a tomb. And this is the alternate version of the I Ching. According to legend, there were two alternate versions which predate the current I Ching. One, written 2,000 years ago, was called Returning to the Earth, and another before that was called Mountain Chain. So in addition to the I Ching we know, there could be these further immortal divination books that go way back. No one's ever found the very oldest one, which would have to be at least 4,000 years old, but they did excavate this alternate version of the I Ching, which was said to be written during the Shang dynasty. This artifact dates to the Han era, but the legends are quite ancient. Here's an example of the contrast between these two I Ching versions. Here's the same hexagram in each version. There's the alternate version on the right, and on the left is the traditional I Ching that we've all grown up with. First is the familiar story from the Wilhelm translation that a bride came to the Zhou kingdom to be married, and she brought her sisters to be married along with her, but her sisters' wedding costumes were better than hers. She came from the dominant kingdom, the Shang dynasty. She was a Shang princess, and when she married into the Zhou family, she had to wear a traditional Zhou wedding dress, while her sisters wore the more sophisticated Shang wedding costume. The marriage was meant to form an alliance between the two kingdoms, and it's an indication of the friction between the Shang and the Zhou. They married her off because they found the Zhou to be a threat, which was correct because the Zhou conquered the Shang one generation later. Here's the same hexagram, but treated in a little-known second version of the I Ching. This alternate version goes back to the Han Dynasty in around 228 BC, and its stories are quite ancient legends. So it's intriguing to discover a second version of the I Ching, and it demonstrates how stories can be associated to any of these 64 immortal numeric hexagrams. So in this wonderful alternate version, a partial fragment dating to 228 BC says, "Returning maiden, Hung-Yi stole the medicine of youth, but fled to the moon and made a divination with yarrow sticks. What's new is we already had a complete copy of this alternate I Ching version, but everybody thought it was a forgery until they found this buried fragment. Here it is in the quite early Han Dynasty, 228 BC, proof positive that it was not a later forgery. In this different version of the I Ching, the hexagram has a charming story about a husband and wife. He requested the medicine of immortality from the Western Queen, Mother, and he sent his wife to pick it up, but his wife stole it and ran away to the moon. Before running away, she performed a divination which determined it would be a good idea, so she flew up to the moon. It's called the Returning Maiden, but she didn't seem to go back to her husband. She flew up to the moon and eventually became the frog in the moon. And here we have on the right the three prominent members of the Zhou dynasty saga, about whom many of the stories in the current I Ching are written. King Wen wrote the I Ching, and with this magical document, his son King Wu was able to overthrow the Shang dynasty. His other son, the Duke of Zhou, later wrote the line statements for the benefit of future generations. The Shang dynasty was the contributor of the princess, married off to their tributary state, the Zhou. This princess probably married King Wen and may have been the mother of King Wu or his brother, the Duke of Zhou. The I Ching is full of these stories, and there's further archaeological evidence, some 3,000-year-old bronze inscriptions to support the story of the Zhou conquest of the Shang. Acknowledgement. Both of the stories I shared were fully explained in books by Edward L. Shaughnessy, the professor of early Chinese studies at the University of Chicago. The frog on the moon was described in his book called Unearthing the Changes, which is all about various archaeological finds related to the I Ching. The story of the celestial dragon was described in his book called Before Confucius. I appreciated reading his books so much, and I'm pleased to share a small part of them with you. Yin and yang are the oars of my boat, and the center is wherever I find myself.